Imagine waking up in a foreign country in the middle of the night. Your room is dark. The doors are locked. The windows are closed. Then you hear something. Not a knock, not footsteps, not a voice. A sound. A piercing mechanical pressure that seems to come from one direction. It does not simply enter your ears. It feels like it enters your head. You move 2 feet to the side, and it changes. You step back, and it returns. Then comes the pressure, the dizziness, the nausea. Your balance disappears. Your ears begin ringing. Your vision becomes strange. Your thoughts feel slow. And when the sound finally stops, you realize something terrifying. Whatever just may have happened without anyone ever entering the room. This is the story of the Havannah Syndrome. The United States government now usually calls these events anomalous health incidents, or AHIs. The cause has never been conclusively established. Intelligence agencies have disagreed over what the evidence means. Medical studies have found very real symptoms without finding a single diagnostic fingerprint that explains every case. But tonight, I want to tell the story from the side that keeps me awake. Because I believe at least some of these people were hit by something. I cannot prove who did it. I cannot prove exactly what the device was. But when trained diplomats, intelligence officers, military personnel, and their families describe sudden, directional sensations followed by disabling symptoms in cities scattered across the world, I have a hard time simply shrugging my shoulders and calling the whole thing coincidence. And the deeper you go into this story, the stranger it gets. Welcome back to One Guy, Two Cups. Grab a cold one. Turn the lights down. And tonight, we are going into a mystery that sounds like science fiction. Except the victims are real. The medical treatment is real. Congress passed laws to compensate affected personnel, and the United States government has spent years trying to figure out what happened. This is the Havannah Syndrome. Chapter 1, Havana, 2016. The story begins in Havana, Cuba, in late 2016. The United States and Cuba were in a delicate period. Diplomatic relations had recently reopened after decades of hostility. American personnel were living and working in a city filled with history, surveillance, old grudges, and intelligence services that knew exactly how to watch foreign diplomats. The American government employees began reporting something bizarre. Some described a sudden loud or unusual sound. Others described pressure in the head. Some said the sensation seemed directional, as though it came from a specific place. Then came the physical symptoms: head pain, ringing in the ear, vertigo, blurred vision, trouble concentrating, problems with balance, memory difficulties. For some people, the symptoms did not disappear when the strange sensation ended. That is important. This was not simply somebody hearing a weird noise in an old building and getting scared. Some affected personnel sought medical care. Some struggled for months or years afterwards. The federal government eventually created systems for treatment and compensation because the suffering was serious enough that it could not simply be ignored. The Government Accountability Office later reported that affected U.S. personnel and family members described sudden symptoms including head pain, tinnitus, vision problems, vertigo, and cognitive difficulties. By January 2024, 334 people with relevant symptoms had qualified for care through the military health system. 344. That does not mean 334 people were proven victims of a weapon. It does mean this became much bigger than one nervous diplomat hearing something strange in Havana. And Havana was only the beginning. Chapter 2. The Sound That Should Not Be There. One of the creepiest details is the way some early cases were described. A sound or sensation would appear to have direction. Think about that. If you have ever stood near a loud generator, a speaker, or a piece of machinery, you know sound fills space. It bounces. It echoes. You may be able to tell generally where it comes from, but it does not normally feel like an invisible spotlight aimed at your skull. Some Havana accounts were different. The National Academies later examined the reports and noted that many early symptoms were consistent with effects that could be associated with direct radio frequency energy. The committee discussed reports of clicking or unusual sounds perceived inside the head, pressure sensations, directionality, tinnitus, balance problems, and other symptoms. That does not prove a microwave weapon existed, but it tells us respected scientists did not miss the possibility as fantasy. And this is where the story takes a turn. Because there's a real phenomenon, sometimes called the microwave auditory effect, or Frey effect, in which pulsed radio frequency energy can create the perception of sound inside the head under certain conditions. Read that again in your mind. Energy you cannot see under certain circumstances create an auditory perception. No hidden speaker required. No person whispering behind a wall. The idea that electromagnetic energy can interact with the human body is not science fiction. The real argument is whether a practical device can have caused this particular symptom. The question remains disputed. But once you know the basic physical phenomenon is real, Havannah Syndrome becomes a much darker story. Because now the question is no longer, could invisible energy ever make somebody perceive a sound? The question becomes, did somebody figure out how to weaponize something related to it? Chapter 3. It spreads. If the incidents had stopped in Cuba, maybe the story would have just faded away. But they did not. Reports associated with anomalous health incidents appeared in other countries and locations. Government reporting has discussed cases or reports connected to places including China, Austria, Colombia, Georgia, Germany, India, Poland, Russia, Vietnam, and the United States. Different places, different buildings, different people. And yet, in some of the more compelling reports, a familiar pattern appeared. Sudden onset, unusual sensory experience, pressure or sound, followed by neurological or vestibular symptoms. Now, This is exactly where skeptics make a fair point. Once a mysterious syndrome becomes widely known, people may begin associating ordinary headaches, tinnitus, dizziness, anxiety, migraines, infections, or environmental exposures with the syndrome. That can make the data messy, and I accept that. I do not believe every headache reported by an American official overseas was an attack. I do not believe every single AHI necessarily had the same cause. In fact, the National Academies itself noted that the wide variation in cases left open the possibility of multiple causes. But that actually makes the core mystery more interesting to me. Because if 90 ordinary cases get mixed together with 10 extraordinary ones, the 90 do not automatically explain the 10. And the investigators themselves have repeatedly focused on subsets of cases that were harder to explain. That is where I keep coming back. Not to every report, to the strange ones, the abrupt ones, the directional ones, the ones where somebody felt normal 1 minute and suddenly experienced an intense localized sensation in the next. Chapter 4. The Perfect Weapon. Suppose for a moment that a hostile intelligence service wanted a weapon that could intimidate, injure, distract, or degrade an adversary without starting a conventional war. What would that perfect weapon look like? You would not want bullets. Bullets leave holes. You would not want explosives. Explosives leave fragments, blast patterns, cameras full of evidence, and usually a very obvious crime scene. You would want something deniable, something that could be used from outside a room, something that might leave the victim alive, something that might produce symptoms doctors initially struggle to categorize, something that could make the victim sound unbelievable. Imagine telling your supervisor, "I think somebody attacked me with an invisible energy." That sentence almost destroys its own credibility. And that is exactly why the concept is so disturbing. A deniable weapon does not have to kill you. It only has to hurt you while making everyone argue about whether you were attacked at all. If such a device existed, the psychological effect would be enormous. Diplomats would wonder whether their hotel rooms were really safe. Intelligence officers would wonder whether a window faced the wrong building. Families would wonder whether their children were being exposed. Every unexplained ringing in the ears would be suspicious. Every headache would become a question. That uncertainty would itself become part of the weapon. And if the attackers were never conclusively identified, the fear could spread much further than the device ever could. Chapter 5. The Russia Question. One name appears again and again in public speculation: Russia. There are historical reasons people look in that direction. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union famously irradiated the U.S. Embassy in Moscow with microwave energy for years in what became known as the Moscow Signal. The purpose remains debated, but the episode established something important. Directing microwave energy at an American diplomatic facility is not an imaginary concept invented for Havannah Syndrome. That history hangs over this entire mystery. But history is not proof. Public U.S. intelligence assessments in 2023 and again in 2025 said most intelligence agencies judged it very unlikely that a foreign adversary was responsible for the broad collection of reported incidents. That sounds like the end of the story, except it's not. The 2025 assessment contained an important wrinkle. Two intelligent components changed part of their view because of new reporting about foreign research and weapons development. They considered it possible that a foreign actor had developed a capability that could produce biological effects consistent with some reported symptoms, even while they still judged actual deployment in reported cases unlikely. In other words, the official position is not, "This technology is impossible." It was closer to, "We do not have enough evidence to conclude an adversary used it in these incidents." Those are very different statements. Then the political and intelligence fight became even stranger. In 2024 and 2025, members of the House Intelligence Committee publicly challenged the intelligence community's conclusion. In June of 2026, House Intelligence Committee Chairman Rick Crawford announced that Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard had recalled the prior intelligence assessment on anomalous health incidents. Crawford described those assessments in extremely critical terms. Now, a congressional chairman making an accusation does not prove the accusation, and recalling an assessment does not prove a microwave weapon attacked anybody. But it does prove something else. As of 2026, the argument inside the United States government is not dead. Far from it. Chapter 6: The Medical Mystery. Here is the part where the story refuses to give us a clean answer. In 2024, the National Institutes of Health published major studies of people who reported anomalous health incidents. The researchers did not find significant MRI detectable brain injuries or a consistent set of biological abnormalities that separated the affected group from controls. For skeptics, that is so powerful, and it should be taken very seriously. But the NIH also emphasized something that matters. The symptoms experienced by these people were real and could be severe. No visible scar on an MRI does not mean nothing happened. A migraine can be devastating without leaving a permanent structural lesion. Vertigo can destroy your ability to stand without creating a dramatic brain scan. Tinnitus can torture somebody for years while medical imaging looks normal. And even NIH researchers acknowledged the possibility that an event could have caused symptoms without producing the long-term imaging changes normally associated with severe trauma or stroke. So when someone says the scans were normal, therefore Havannah Syndrome was fake, that goes further than the evidence allows. The studies did not prove an energy weapon. They also did not prove that affected people imagined their experiences. That uncomfortable middle ground is exactly where this mystery lies. Chapter 7: Why I Believe Something Happened. Here is where I tell you where I stand. I believe at least a subset of these incidents involved a real external event. Maybe it was a directed radio frequency energy. Maybe it was some other form of a directed energy. Maybe it was a surveillance system producing unintended biological effects. Maybe it was an experimental device being tested in the field. I don't know. And anybody who tells you they know exactly what happened is probably giving you the certainty the evidence does not support. But I keep coming back to several things. First, the early descriptions, the sudden onset, the localized sensation, the apparent directionality, the pressure, the vestibular symptoms. Second, the National Academies did not dismiss directed radio frequency energy. Its 2020 committee found that directed, pulsed RF energy appeared to be a plausible mechanism for important features of the early cases. Third, the intelligence community later assessment acknowledged that some agencies believed foreign actors may possess or be developing relevant capabilities. Fourth, hundreds of people entered government systems seeking care, and Congress treated the problem seriously enough to create compensation mechanisms. And fifth, after years of official skepticism, the argument inside government continued, and in 2026, the previous intelligence assessments were recalled. None of those facts alone proves an attack. Put together, they are enough to make me refuse to close the case. Chapter 8. Imagine being the target. Picture this. You are an American intelligence officer overseas. It is 2:13 in the morning. Your spouse is asleep. The air conditioner hums. Cars occasionally move somewhere beyond the window. Then you hear a clicking sensation. Not exactly in the room, inside you. You sit up. The sensation becomes stronger. Your head feels full, almost pressurized. You stand. The floor shifts beneath you. You take one step towards the bathroom, and the sensation weakens. You step back toward the bed, and it intensifies. Now you are terrified. You wake your spouse. They do not hear what you're hearing. You move towards the hallway. The sensation disappears. Your ears keep ringing. You feel sick. You tell security. They search the room. There's nothing. No intruder. No device. No broken window. No poison canister. Nothing. The next morning, you still cannot walk normally. Days later, you cannot concentrate. Weeks later, bright lights bother you. Months later, people are still asking whether it was stress. That scenario is dramatized. I'm not claiming it describes one specific victim word for word, but it captures the nightmare at the center of the Havannah Syndrome. An attack with no attacker. A weapon with no recovered weapon. An injury with no universal diagnostic marker. A crime scene, but nothing obvious left behind. If you were designing something to create confusion, you could hardly design a better mystery. Chapter 9. The problem with mass hysteria. One explanation that has followed Havannah Syndrome is psychogenetic illness. Symptoms influenced or generated by psychological and social factors. Psychogenic illness is real. Stress can produce powerful physical symptoms. Groups can influence how symptoms are interpreted. But I have always disliked the way people casually use the word hysteria, as though they settled the case. They did not. The national academies considered psychological and social explanations, but noted that some of the unusual directional audiovestibular features reported in Cuba were not typical of common descriptions of mass psychogenic illness. Again, that does not prove a weapon. It simply means the easy explanation is not necessarily a complete explanation. And there is another issue. These were people working in environments where surveillance, harassment, espionage, and counterintelligence threats were not imaginary. A CIA officer overseas is not paranoid merely because they consider the possibility that a hostile intelligence service is watching them. That is literally part of their environment. So when several people in that world report bizarre experiences, investigators have to walk a narrow line. Do not believe everything automatically, but do not miss everything automatically either. Chapter 10. The Window. One detail from the National Academy's report has always bothered me. Some early reports suggested symptoms seemed associated with particular physical locations and sometimes with directionality near windows. A window is ordinary. But in a story about directed energy, a window becomes something else. A line of sight. Imagine a device in a nearby building. A van, a hotel room, a rooftop. It does not have to look like a giant science fiction cannon. If this technology exists in a deployable form, the entire point would be concealment. Maybe the operator watches through optics. Maybe the target never knows where the beam comes from. Maybe the exposure lasts seconds, maybe minutes. Maybe the attacker is not trying to kill. Maybe they are collecting data. How much energy? How far away? What symptoms? How long do they last? Does the target recover? Can doctors detect anything afterward? And that possibility is the darkest one of all. What if Havannah was not an assassination attempt? What if it was a field test? Chapter 11. A test you cannot prove. Think about how weapons development works. Prototype, test, measure, adjust, test again. If a government wanted to develop a non-lethal or less than lethal directed energy system, human effects would be the most sensitive and controversial part of the program. No ethical American research board is going to approve secretly blasting unsuspecting diplomats to see what happens. But an adversarial intelligence service operating without those constraints? That is a different question. I want to be clear. There is no public proof that Havannah Syndrome was a human weapons experiment. This is a theory. But it is a theory that fits unsettling nature of the reports. Scattered incidents, inconsistent effects, different severity, no obvious projectile, no recovered weapon, and uncertainty even years later. That is exactly what a secret experimental capability might look like from the victim's side. Messy, confusing, almost impossible to prove. Chapter 12. The government's impossible position. Now imagine you are running the United States government's response. If you publicly announce that a foreign country has attacked American officials with an exotic energy weapon, you need evidence, and real evidence. Evidence strong enough to survive intelligence scrutiny, scientific scrutiny, diplomatic consequences, and possibly military consequences. You need a device, an operator, intercepted communications, technical measurements, something. Without that, accusing another country could trigger an international crisis. So intelligence agencies naturally set a high bar. But victims live under a different standard. They do not need to know which intelligence service signed the order. They know what they felt. They know what happened to their balance and their hearing and their memory, their careers and their families. That creates a brutal gap. The government says, we cannot attribute this. The victims here, we do not believe you. Those are not the same sentence. But when you are the person suffering, they can feel exactly the same. The GAO found that many affected people struggle to navigate care and reported inconsistent support and poor communication. That is a bureaucratic problem, but in a mystery like this, bureaucracy feeds suspicion. Every delayed appointment feels like concealment. Every conflicting statement feels like a cover-up. Every classified answer creates another shadow. And eventually, nobody trusts anybody. Chapter 13. What would proof look like? So what would finally solve Havannah Syndrome? A capture device would help. Technical data recorded during an incident would help. A foreign intelligence officer defecting with documents would help. Intercepted orders describing a program would help. A reproducible medical signature linked to a specific exposure would help. Until something like that appears publicly, the mystery remains. And that is why two intelligent people can look at the same evidence and reach opposite conclusions. One person sees hundreds of varied cases, normal imaging, no recovered weapon, and intelligent assessments pointing away from a foreign campaign. They conclude there was no attack. Another person sees abrupt directional experiences, documented severe symptoms, scientific discussion of pulsed RF mechanisms, historical microwave targeting of diplomatic facilities, continuing classified investigation, and disagreement inside the government. They could conclude something happened. I'm in the second group. Not because every rumor is true, not because I think every unexplained illness is a secret weapon, but because I think there are enough strange pieces here that declaring the mystery solved would be premature. Chapter 14. The Scariest Possibility. The scariest possibility is not that somebody built a death ray. The scariest possibility is subtler. What if the technology exists that can temporarily disrupt a human being from a distance? What if it can cause pain, confusion, dizziness, nausea, disorientation, or auditory sensations? What if the power can be adjusted? What if the device is portable? What if it leaves little evidence? What if the operator can just sit across the street, And what if, after the victim collapses, the world's best intelligence agencies spend 10 years arguing about whether the attack even happened? That is not simply a weapon. That is strategic invisibility. You could harass an embassy without firing a shot. You could make an intelligence officer afraid to return to a post. You could disrupt a meeting. You could intimidate a source. You could make a target look unstable. And if anybody complained, you could deny everything. Show us the weapon. Show us the bullet. Show us the chemical. Show us the brain scan. And if they cannot, you just walk away. Chapter 15. The part that should bother you. Here is the part I want you to remember after this episode ends. Havannah Syndrome is not proven to be a foreign-directed energy attack. That sentence matters. But this sentence matters too. It has not been publicly explained in a way that accounts for every compelling case and ends the controversy. The NIH found no consistent MRI detectable brain injury, but acknowledged severe symptoms. The National Academies found directed pulse radio frequency energy plausible for key features of earlier cases, while emphasizing uncertainty and limitations. The intelligence community largely moved away from the foreign attack hypothesis, but some components later shifted their assessment of foreign technical capability. Congressional investigators challenged the intelligence community conclusion, and in 2026, the prior assessments were recalled amid that dispute. That is not what a cleanly solved mystery looks like. That is what an unresolved national security argument looks like. So what happened in Havana? Was it a secret weapon? A surveillance technology with unintended effects? A collection of unrelated illnesses? Psychological or environmental factors? Maybe a mixture of all of them. I don't know. But if you ask me what I believe some of those people encountered something external and something unusual. Something that frightened them because it did not behave like an ordinary illness. And I believe the absence of a smoking gun does not automatically mean there was no gun. Sometimes the most effective weapon is the one that leaves everyone arguing over whether it exists. Tonight, when your house gets quiet, when the refrigerator stops humming, when the traffic outside disappears, listen, not for footsteps, not for a door, for a sound that does not belong, a faint clicking, a high tone, a pressure you cannot explain. And if you move across the room and it follows you, or worse, if it stops, ask yourself one question. Was it ever really a sound? Thanks for joining us once again on One Guy, Two Cups. I hope you enjoyed that story. If you did, please subscribe, like, and follow. It really helps our channel. And thank you for listening. Goodbye.